Hello. Psychology can help us control the world by controlling people for the good. Of course, taking into account ethical considerations. Self-affirmation refers to the action of providing a person with certain information that affirms the self of the person, meaning that the information makes the person realize that he or she is okay. People can take self-affirming actions themselves, but this psychological process can also be mimicked or induced by a psychological procedure. As this procedure is based on proven knowledge of existing psychological laws, it is technology. This piece of technology can help us to persuade people, to control their behavior, to help fulfill their values and desires. It all starts with the fact that people know the world through their mental representations of the world. The mental representation is not a photo or a video, but one way or another we can see objects, people, and even abstract meaning in our mind. For example, we have a mental representation of other people, of specific persons, but also of groups of people. All people who have a car will also have a mental representation of their car. In addition, we have a mental representation of the universe. These representations may differ much. The one sees a simple star, the other sees billions of stars or multiple galaxies. We can also create or fantasize mental representations of the future, global or in detail. We not only see the content of the mental representations, like the car is red, but we also value the person or object to a certain extent. We evaluate the person or object. For example, a person may feel strongly attracted to the person in the mental representation, or not at all like the red car. Importantly, people also have a mental representation of themselves, of how they are, their hair color, their body shape, their plans, personality, experiences, and many other aspects. This self-image is very complex, containing a lot of details. In addition, as with all other mental representations, we also attach a value to this self. We evaluate ourselves. A crucial need of people, and this is a psychological law, is that people want to describe a positive value to their self-image. They want to like themselves. That is, people want to feel adequate, consistent, and adaptive. This partly has evolutionary roots. When people become aware that they themselves cause negative outcomes, trouble or danger for themselves, their positive value is threatened. This threat is called a self-threat, and it is experienced as self-evaluative emotions, such as feeling dissatisfied or angry with oneself, regret, or shame. People cannot live with a self-threat. They automatically try to repair it. People are motivated to reduce the self-threat. This can be done using different psychological mechanisms. These mechanisms are related. Health threat information may make people aware of the danger they impose onto themselves. This leads to negative self-evaluation, a self-threat, experienced as a negative aversive state. People want to get rid of this negative state. The negative self-evaluation now is limited to being the actor of the specific unhealthy behavior. This leads to a specific isolated self-threat that's experienced as negative self-evaluative emotions with regard to engaging in the specific dangerous behavior. The first and obvious reaction is to listen to the specific threat and transfer it into the motivation to change the dangerous behavior. Problem solved. However, it may be that the dangerous behavior has valued functions, or that the alternative new behavior demands relevant investments. In that case, changing the specific behavior is not the first option. Not changing the dangerous behavior leads to a generalized self-threat. The person is now a person who endangers oneself and therefore is unadaptive and inadequate. When the self-threat has spread over the self because changing behavior is not an option, the second possible reaction to the threat is to engage in self-affirmative actions, in thinking or in behavior. One central aspect of self-affirmation is that a threat caused in one domain, for example in the domain of health, may be compensated by an affirmation in another domain, for example in the social domain, in the domain of personal achievements. For example, a person may work extra hard or may donate money to a good cause. These are good behaviors, they affirm the self, thereby compensating the generalized threat. However, when self-affirmation is not possible or not effective and behavior change is not an option, people may engage in a defensive reaction, in thinking or in behavior. This is a type of emotion regulation that avoids or distorts the incoming threatening health information in such a way that it no longer activates the negative self-evaluation. As you may have figured out, this model implies that when people successfully affirm their self, they may no longer have to get defensive. Self-affirmation resolved the spread of the self-threat. In the case of a self-threat, the three options may all be considered, but people often have their unique preferences and their estimates and experiences of the effectiveness and the needed investments of each reaction, the benefits and costs of each action. And this is an example of a person weighing the benefits and costs. According to this person, behavior change has strong benefits, the green bar, but also high costs, the red bar. Thus, behavior change is effective but demands high investments. Self-affirmation has limited effectiveness and does not outweigh the needed investments. Defensive action has high effectiveness and clearly outweighs the needed investments. According to this specific incentive structure, this person will probably engage in a defensive action. Little is known about the relative frequencies of the three possible actions and the spread of the threat, but it is clear that defensive self-regulation indeed is a common reaction. Because this lowers the self-threat, it preserves the dangerous behavior. These defensive reactions lower the impact of persuasive messages. To prevent this undesired effect, we must target the psychological processes that are involved. Self-affirmation might be used to this purpose. This is another depiction of what happens when people become aware of what they are doing to themselves around the process of self-affirmation. This still is the spontaneous, natural sequence of things. When health threat information makes people aware, negative self-evaluation is activated. When changing behavior is not an option, this may activate self-affirmative actions. Therefore, defensive reactions are no longer needed, and people get open-minded. They feel that, basically, everything is alright. They themselves are alright, solid, integer and adaptive. There's no need to fear a threat to the self. Look, the sun is shining, and listen, the birds are singing. Open-minded. The fact that self-affirmation leads to open-mindedness can be used now to prevent defensiveness, to increase persuasion. But how can we self-affirm people? There are different means, and this is one we mostly use based on Alport's scales of values. People are asked to choose your most important value and next your least important value from 6 value domains: technology, religion, social relations, science, art or economy. The self-affirmation is accomplished with this assignment. The person is asked to answer 10 dichotomous questions, with each time one option concerning the individual's most important domain. Repeatedly choosing what one finds important in life leads to a clear, well-defined and relevant self, integer and adequate. Now, using self-affirmation as a procedure, the picture would look like this. Before being confronted with the health threat information, People are self-affirmed by engaging in the self-affirmation procedure. This lowers the need to be defensive. After all, everything is okay. I am okay. At that very moment that the person is open-minded, the person is exposed to health threat information. The person now dares to look at its own unhealthy behavior. He or she is confident enough to acknowledge it. And this leads to a specific threat: negative self-evaluative emotions caused by engaging in the dangerous behavior. Because of the open-mindedness, the negative emotions are now channeled to changing the dangerous behavior. Thus, the health threat information is timed with the open-mindedness. Then, defensive reactions are avoided and persuasion will occur. Here's self-affirmation in another depiction. The orange blob is the self. It is orange, meaning that it feels solid and adequate. The yellow dotted line shows that the person is open-minded. When the threatening information is processed, the self becomes red. It is under threat. When changing the unhealthy behavior is not a first option, a generalized self-threat is induced. Then, in a negative feedback loop, defensive self-regulation is activated to lower the threat. The yellow bar is thickened. It is impenetrable. Now the self is orange again. The threat has been averted. Let's play it again. The self becomes red when the information is processed, but defensive regulation closes down the information processing, restoring the orange, solid and adequate self. Because of this, there is no need to change the unhealthy behavior. But now we are going to induce positive self-images using a self-affirmation procedure. These images are a source of self-esteem, thereby lowering the generalized threat and the need to be defensive. It induces open-mindedness. Now the self is turning red again. A specific negative self-evaluation is experienced, which can now be used to motivate behavior change. Now back to reality. Does it really work? Does a self-affirmation procedure lead to more persuasion? Two meta-analyses have been conducted. Both come to the same conclusion. Scientific studies show significant but small effects of self-affirmation procedures on intentions and on behavior. To summarize and conclude, self-affirmation procedures lower defensive reactions, leading to open-mindedness. The self-affirmation procedure is one more tool in the box to increase persuasion. The application of the self-affirmation procedure in realistic interventions, however, is still in its infancy. The story of self-affirmation shows how we get from psychological process to psychological procedure. Bye.